186, and it will load the same notes that we're using here in class. So lesson 186 is titled the AV 1611, Addressing the Questions of Authorization and Copyright. So we are now officially to a point where we're going to actually be talking about the 1611 volume itself, okay? The Bible that came off the press in the year 1611, which was the culmination of the fruit of this process that we've been studying now over the last year and a half, as we've been looking at the creation of the King James Bible and trying to do it with a fair amount of detail. So lesson 186, the AV 1611, Addressing the Questions of Authorization and Copyright. Introduction. Last time we met in lesson 185, we considered the following points: Bancroft, Bilson, Smith, and the finishing touches. And then we also looked at the publisher, Robert Barker, the King's printer. So last time we had this class, lesson 185, we looked at those two topics, okay? Now, there's more to say today about one of those topics. One of the topics discussed was the long-standing rumor regarding Archbishop Richard Bancroft's having altered 14 readings before the text went to print. So we talked about this rumor that is of long-standing history of Bancroft having altered 14 readings, okay? My friend and fellow research partner, Christopher Yetzer, commented on last week's video on YouTube, so that would have been from 2 weeks ago now, and directed me to look at King James, his Bible, and its translators by Lawrence M. Vance. Vance references a document held by Lambeth Palace Library that extends the charge of textual tampering on the part of high church bishops beyond Bancroft. Okay, this is what he says, quote, "A manuscript about the translators in the Lambeth Palace Library, apparently written about 1650, record that Richard Brent, a translator on the Oxford Old Testament Company, reported, quote, that bishops altered many places that the translators had agreed upon. He had a note of those places. Bishop Bancroft, the chief overseer, is said to have made 14 changes. He died November 2, 1610, never seeing the translation published that he had overseen." So here we have again, and this was sent to me, and I looked into this, and here we have a statement in this document of the bishops. Notice the quote there. The bishops altered very many places the translators had agreed upon. And then he talks about Bishop Bancroft, the chief overseer, is said to have made 14 changes. So here we have another statement about the fact that there were these 14 changes. All right. Now, if you look at the next point, Dr. B.F. Westcott reproduces this Lambeth Palace manuscript in Appendix 12, see pages 346 through 350 of his book, A General History of the English Bible. The name of the manuscript is the Gibson Papers, Volume 5, Number 41. Moreover, Charles C. Butterworth mentions this in his 1941 book, The Literary Lineage of the King James Bible, 1340 to 1611. Quote, "It remains to add that a series of memorandum concerning the translators set down about 1640 in speaking of Richard Brent, who worked with the first Oxford companies, contains this comment, quote, Dr. Brent reported that bishops altered very many places that the translators had agreed upon. He had a note of the places. According to another report, Archbishop Bancroft himself insisted upon certain changes being made in a few places," end quote. So guys, what you need to see here is, do we have a fairly substantial bit of evidence here to suggest that the Anglican bishops tampered with certain portions of the text after the translators were done and before it went to print, okay? We are seeing that now from many different places, okay? And this work here by Westcott, I should have called it up. Do I still have it called up? I don't think I do. But I had it called up at one point, and I could look at it myself because it was reproduced by Westcott in this book, A General View of the History of the Bible, and then it's quoted by Butterworth, it's quoted by Vance. Westcott reproduces it in his book, okay? Thanks to the fine work, so last point on page 1, thanks to the fine work of Timothy Berg, I have been able to view an image of the manuscript in the Lambeth Palace Library that mentions Dr. Brent and his report regarding the bishops altering, quote, many places. Okay? Due to copyright limitations, I am not at liberty to share the image publicly at this time. So, Brother Berg shared the image with me with the strict agreement that I not put it in the notes. And the reason for that is there's not public release permission and copyright to show that image publicly. I don't know how Brother Berg came by it. He might have taken the picture himself when he was in Britain a few years back looking at some of this stuff. But due to copyright limitations, I'm not at liberty to share the image publicly at this time. Internal evidence suggests that the manuscript was written about 1651, as it mentions the late wife of translator John Harding, who died in 1650. Friend and fellow researcher Christopher Yetzer has also pointed out that this document testifies to the fact that as early as 1650, several people were already trying to gather histories on the translators. Okay? So what we see there, guys, is from very early, we have documentation that suggests this idea, this rumor, has some credibility to it, that bishops of the Anglican Church altered certain readings at the very late stage of the process, before it was printed, up to and including Bishop Bancroft, but not limited to Bancroft. Okay, look at top page 2. In a sermon dated April 3, 1648, Dr. Thomas Hill, master of Trinity College in Cambridge, delivered a sermon in which he mentions 14 changes that to the translation, that had been made by prelates of the Church of England. Okay, so this is a dated sermon. All right, so let me just show you this. The University of Michigan, aside from being Big Ten champions, by the way, they do a website called Early English Books Online, and there's a sermon here by Thomas Hill. It's in a collection of sermons that was published in 1653, but this particular sermon, here's the title of it, Truth and Love, Happily Married in the Saints and the Churches of the Saints, a contract drawn in one of the what he calls the Spittle sermons, and notice it has a preach date on it of April 3, 1648. Okay? Now, I want to go here. Okay? And I want to go up. Here's where I want. So here's where I'm quoting from. So look at the notes. I have it. So this is Thomas Hill in the sermon dated April 3, 1648. He says, quote, I have it from certain hands, such as those as lived in those times, that when the Bible had been translated by the translators appointed, the New Testament was looked over by some of the great prelates. Men I could name some of their persons, to bring it to speak prelatical language. Okay, so stop right there. What is that? What is he saying? What is Thomas Hill saying? He's saying that he has it from the hands of some of the people that knew what they were talking about, that did the Anglican bishops alter some of the readings so that it would suit Anglican doctrine. That's what he's saying. So when he's talking here and he says, was overlooked by some of the great prelates, men I could name some of their persons, to bring it to speak prelatical language, as they did alter, as I am informed by means of one that was a great observer of those times and lived them, 14 places in the New Testament to make them speak the language of the Church of England that was so cried up, and I'll tell you some of them. So here we have a sermon preached by Dr. Thomas Hill in 1648, and is he clearly identifying and confirming some of the rumors that we're investigating here. Was it a known fact that the charge had been made that some of the Anglican bishops altered the text to insert pro-Anglican readings? That's what he's saying. Okay? He says that he knows the names, and then notice the last line there. Notice this line right here. Okay? 14 places in the New Testament to make them speak the language of the Church of England, as was so cried up. I'll tell you what. Some of them. So what he's going to say next is he's going to give you some of the examples of the passages where they were crying foul. Okay? So look at the next part of the notes, page 2. Hill then goes on to identify half a dozen or so of the changes made by Anglican bishops to the text after the translation work had been completed. So before we read this, let's understand what we're about to read. Okay? In the last lesson, lesson 185, and so far in this lesson, have we been investigating the idea that Archbishop Bancroft, along with some of the other bishops of the Anglican Church, altered some of the readings to suit Anglican theology at the very end of this when the translators had finished their work. Okay? We've seen things from 1650. Now we're looking at a sermon from 1648. This Thomas Hill guy is now going to give us some examples of the 14 places where people had cried foul, most notably Miles Smith from lesson 185, of where these changes had taken place. Okay? So, page 2, Hill then goes on to identify half a dozen of the changes made by Anglican bishops to the text after the translation work had been completed. Look at the long quote here. First, in the first of the Acts, speaking of Judas, let another man take his bishopric. It is forced. It signifies charge or inspection, but that ye may believe that the bishops are the apostles' successors, let another man take his bishopric. Okay, so grab your Bible. Go to Acts 1. And let's understand what Thomas Hill is saying. So he is saying that this passage is one of the 14 passages that were identified by people of the day as having been altered by Bancroft and or other bishops. Okay? Look at Acts 1. Look at verse 20. So the context is Judas has committed suicide. He's betrayed the Lord. He's killed himself, and they're discussing who the replacement is going to be. Look at verse 15. In those days, Peter stood up in the midst of the disciples and said, the number of the names together were about 120. Men and brethren, this scripture must needs have been fulfilled, which the Holy Ghost by the mouth of David spake before concerning Judas, which was guide to them that took Jesus. For he was numbered with us and obtained part of this ministry. Now this man purchased the field with the reward of iniquity, and falling headlong, he burst asunder in the midst, and his bowels gushed out. So that's talking about how Judas died. And it was known unto all the dwellers at Jerusalem, inasmuch as the field is called in the proper tongue, Akamala, which is to say the field of blood. Now look at verse 20. As it is written in the book of the Psalms, let his habitation be desolate, and let no man dwell therein. Here it is. And his bishopric let another take. So do you see the use of the word bishopric there? What is Hill saying? What is Hill saying in his sermon from 1648? He is saying that that verse right there is a place where the Anglican bishops altered the text by inserting the word bishopric in there to help them teach their idea of apostolic succession. Read the quote again. So I'm right here. So there's no confusion. First, in the first of the Acts, speaking of Judas, let another man take his bishopric. It is forced. It signifies change or inspection. So what Hill is saying is that to make it read bishopric is a forced reading. That's what he's saying. Now, we could agree or disagree with that. That's not the point right now. The point is, what is Hill saying about what happened? You guys following me? Okay, notice again. It is forced. It signifies change or inspection, but that you may believe that the bishops are the apostles' successors. Let another man take his what? Bishopric. What is Hill saying? Hill is saying very clearly that the bishops altered that reading, inserted the word bishopric to help them substantiate their doctrine of apostolic succession. That's what he's saying. Okay? Now listen, this isn't me, Brian Ross, dreaming this up because I just want to create problems, okay? This is a dude in a sermon from 1648 saying that he heard from people that said this is one of the 14 changes. You following that? Let's keep going. And again, in the second of Acts, it is not suffer my soul to lie in hell. This is clear. Former translations have it, not suffer my soul to lie in the grave. But it was learned Bilson's opinion. So that's Bilson. Bilson is mentioned by name. Remember what I taught you in lesson 185. Thomas Bilson, along with Miles Smith, were the two guys that saw the text through to the press. Here's Hill in a sermon from 1648 saying that Bilson messed with that verse. Okay, let's finish the quote, or the next paragraph of the quote. Again, in the second of Acts, it is not suffer my soul to lie in hell. This is clear. Former translations have it, not suffer my soul to lie in the grave, but it was learned Bilson's opinion and thrust into the 39 articles that Christ did locally descend into hell. And to make this translation agree with the articles, they must change grave into hell. So, again, understand what Hill is saying. The 39 articles are a draft of Anglican belief, almost like a doctrinal statement or a creedal statement. Okay? In the 39 articles, it talks about hell, not the grave. And what Hill is saying here in this sermon from 1648 is that Bilson changed it from grave to hell so that the reading would match what?
Former translation.
Not the former translation, but the 39 articles of the Anglican Church.
I was
No, that's fine. But you understand what Hill's saying here. Okay? Next one. Next paragraph. So we're on this paragraph now. Also, the 14th of the Acts, they ordained them elders. They loved to cry up consecration of churches and dedication and such kind of things, and episcopal ordination too. For these all advanced the power of the priests and the bishops, which brought in transubstantiation amongst papists, and therefore in the Geneva translation that was rendered chosen by suffrages by lifting up of hands. The word primarily imports that. So he's saying that he doesn't agree with the way it reads based upon the Geneva Bible. Okay? It may be some of the fathers, it includes both, they will tell you, because afterwards, having chosen elders by suffrages or voices, they did ordain them. Now, I'll be honest with you, his reasoning on this one is a little bit weird to me. It's a little bit fuzzy. I don't claim to necessarily track with everything Hill is saying on this, other than it's clear is he making the accusation that it reads the way it does because the bishops wanted it to read that way. They felt it strengthened the Anglican position against the Puritans to have the text read in that fashion. And I believe, turn to Acts 14. Mike, have you found the verse they're talking about?
No, I have not.
23.
Acts 14:23 is the verse that Hill is talking about. Okay? It says, and when they had ordained them elders in every church and had prayed with fasting, they commanded them to the Lord whom they believed. Now, I don't have this in the notes, so I'm going to take a risk, and I want to check this verse using some tools. Okay? So, what is the reference here? Acts what?
14:23.
Acts 14:23. Search. Okay, so let's start with Tyndall. Tyndall said, and they had ordained them elders by election in every congregation after they had, not sure what that word, prayed, that's prayed and fasted, they commended them to God on whom they believed. Okay, let's go to the Geneva. And when they had ordained them elders by election in every church and prayed and fasted, they commended them to the Lord in whom they believed. Let's check the bishops. And when they had ordained them elders by election in every church and had prayed with fasting, I think this is the part that he's objecting to, the by election. Maybe not. So I looked at this before, and I will be honest, I wasn't quite following what point Hill was making here, other than he doesn't like the word ordain. Okay, so let's just go back and look at that. So if you look at Geneva, it says, they commended them to the Lord in whom they believed. If you look at the bishops, commended them to the Lord on whom they believed. So then that tells me that the part that he's objecting to is the use of the word what? Ordain. He views it as a word of too high church influence. Okay? Now, look at the next one. He says, next I come to 1 Corinthians 12:28. So let's turn to 1 Corinthians 12:28. Now you know, those of you that have been here, that I've talked about this one before. 1 Corinthians 12:28. And let me find it here. Bear with me for 1 second. So here is the 1611. And we want right here, verse 28. Okay? So here's verse 28 in the 1611. And God has set some in the church, first apostles, secondarily prophets, thirdly teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healing, watch, helps in governments, diversities of tongues. Okay, how does yours read?
Helps,
comma.
Yours says helps, comma, what? Governments. Thereby distinguishing helps and governments as two separate what? Two separate gifts, right? The 1611 reads helps in governments, meaning this is modifying this. They're not separate things. Okay? Now remember, we talked about this before in one of the lessons we were looking at manuscript 98. So let's go back to Hill's sermon. He says, next I come to 1 Corinthians 12:28. An abominable violence offered to the original, God hath set in the church apostles, comma, teachers, comma, helps, comma, governments. And you shall find here a great imposture. It may be now altered, appearing so gross, but I have seen it and read in some translations, helps in government. So what is he saying? Is he saying that that verse right there is a verse that they altered to make it fit Anglican theology? Okay? Now we've already talked about this. So here's a guy in a sermon from 1648. Now by the time you get to 1648, it has already been fixed. This is wrong. It should not read helps in governments. It should read helps, comma, what? Governments. Okay? Let's go look at it. What's the reference on this one? 1 Corinthians 12:28. All right. First Corinthians 12:28. Go to the Bishop's Bible. Remember that Bishop's Bible is the base text. What's it have? It says helps, comma, what? Helpers, comma, governments. Are they two separate things?
Yeah.
Okay? We could go to the Geneva Bible. Got the same thing. Helpers, comma, what? Governors. Diversities of tongues, right? So out of the blue, we all of a sudden have this reading here in the 1611 that says helps, comma, what? Helps in governments. Okay? What's this guy's name again? What Hill is saying is that verse was messed with by who? By Bancroft and the bishops, to make it read the way they wanted it to read to support their view of church governance. Okay? So let's read that paragraph again. Also, next. Next I come to the 1 of Corinthians 12:28. An abominable violence offered to the original. God hath set in the church apostles, comma, teachers, comma, helps, comma, governments, comma. And ye shall find here in a great imposture it may be now altered, appearing so gross. So in other words, that was fixed. That reading in the 1611 was fixed in I want to say 1628. They changed it back to what it should say. It should say helps, comma, governments. Helps in governments is not what the original says. You with me? So he's acknowledging that by 1648, you're going to find some copies that have changed it, but you're also going to have copies that were still in circulation and use that had it the old way. That helps in governments. Okay? Appearing so gross, but I have seen it and read in some translations, helps in governments, which is a most horrible, prodigious, am I saying that word right?
Yeah.
Prodigious violence to the Greek words, for they are both the accusative case. Helps, there are elders. Government, there are deacons. Now to obscure these, you must put it helps in government. You see what he's saying? That verse right there is hitting upon a disagreement between the Anglicans and the Puritans over church governance. Okay? And he's saying that shows up early on in the conversation as a place that an Anglican reading was inserted. Because he's still talking about the 14 the 14 places that were alleged to be tampered with by Bancroft. Okay, now, let's go to the next one.
Just one clarification.
Yeah.
On the helps and government, these are referring only to the church, not
Correct.
Not government in what we think of today.
Not in political secular government. These are spiritual gifts for the body of Christ in this context in 1 Corinthians 12.
What exactly is helps then? Is that...
So, I don't know. All I know is that they're two separate things in the text.
Is that like charity and helping?
It would be somebody that have the gift to help other people. Yeah, it would be that sort of a gift towards practical charity towards other people or something like that. Whereas a government would be the ability to administrate and oversee things in the assembly. Okay? But here's the thing. So look at this last line here. Okay? Helps, there are elders. So if you look at the marginal notes in the 1560 Geneva Bible, translated by not Anglicans, but translated by the people that took refuge in Calvin's Geneva during the reign of Bloody Mary, they say in the margin to the 1560 Geneva Bible that helps are elders. Okay? Helps, there are elders. Government, there are deacons. So in the Puritan understanding of church governance, deacons and elders are two separate, distinct what? Things. In the order and the thinking of the Anglican hierarchical church, those are subservient. A deacon is subservient to a bishop or an elder. And so when it reads helps in governments, it's intending to convey the Anglican understanding of church politics. That's what Hill is saying. You following this? Okay. Now look, guys, I'm just going to pause here and say, what we're covering right now is inconvenient information for the vast majority of King James defenders. Okay? Because there's not supposed to be this kind of stuff happening. It's supposed to be pure and pristine and, there's not supposed to be this kind of funny business going on. My point is, I am personally convinced that this instance here in 1 Corinthians 12:28 is not a printer error. It is an intentional reading put there by a high church bishop to make it read the way he wants it to read. Okay? Later it is fixed, and it is correct in your 1769 edition of the King James Bible that you have in front of you. It reads the way it should have read the whole time, and the way it did read the whole time until all of a sudden, out of the blue in 1611, there's this weird reading that no one's ever seen before in English. You following this? And then we have sermons by guys identifying this verse in the list of the 14 changes that were made by who? Bancroft. Okay? So there's a lot of history here that you're going to have to deal with on some inconvenient points. And I don't mean necessarily you folks here immediately in the class, but people that are going to be listening to this. Because what I'm saying right now is like sacrilege for some folks. Okay? But what I'm saying is we got to have a view that is accurate. Did it eventually get fixed? Yes. All right, this last part here. I had it related since the delivery of this plain sermon by one who most confidently affirmed it, that the learned man to whom it belonged to translate the first book of Samuel, having rendered that with Samuel from God concerning Saul, 1 Samuel 8:11, this shall be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons, etc. He was sent for to Lambeth, and there persuaded to make the words, will take your sons. Shall take, which he conscientiously refused, well knowing it was not spoken by Samuel to Saul by way of direction for duty what he should do, but prophetically and eventually what he would do. So what he's saying there is somebody went to Lambeth and said that you need to alter this what? This reading. Okay, that's what Hill is saying in this sermon from 1648. Okay? Now, so let's be clear. Do we have now a sermon from a guy from 1648 who identifies the rumor that 14 changes were made by Bancroft and other bishops, tells you, names Bilson by name in one of the examples, and gives you about half a dozen examples of the 14 places? Okay, so let's look at the next point in the notes, top page 3. Find it, hang on. Hill's sermon also contains a discussion of the word Easter in the late translation. Now, and I'll show you where he does this, just so you can see. The next one here, right here, and lastly for Easter. So that's the last example. So he gives 6 examples of the 14. Okay? Hill's sermon also contains discussion of the word Easter in the late translation. These comments are nebulous and no specific scripture reference is cited. While Hill's list is helpful for identifying a handful of readings that were influenced by Anglican bishops, he does not name names, and I should probably say comma with the exception, we should add, with the exception of Bilson, because he does mention Bilson specifically. Okay? According to Berg, it is in a 1671 biography of Henry Jesse that the charges of textual tampering ascribed to Bancroft. Finding the notes of Brett, one of the translators, would prove to be a massive find and go a long way towards clearing up the confusion. So remember that Brett, so where is Brett coming in? Okay, so go back to the first page of the notes and recall the document that is in, where's the document at again? Lambeth Palace manuscript. So I'm halfway down the page where it says Dr. B.F. Westcott. Okay, the document is the Gibson Papers, Volume 5, Number 4, where we have the statement that Dr. Brett reporting the bishops having altered many places in the translation, many places that the translators had agreed upon. He made a note of the places. So, if we could find that document, would that be a huge find? Yeah. So, let's go back to page 3. Suffice it to say that from very early in the printed history, while many of the translators were still alive, complaints had arisen among the translators themselves that bishops of the Anglican Church, up to and including Archbishop Richard Bancroft, had altered the text without the consent of the other translators. For the time being, this must remain one of the unsolved mysteries related to the publication of the King James Bible. In this lesson, we want to consider the following points regarding the publication of the King James Bible. So that was a 40-minute introduction. Okay. We want to look at the question of authorization and confronting the copyright myth. So before we do that, does anybody have any questions about what we just covered? Now let me tell you something. It would have been extremely easy for me to just skip this. It would be much more neat and tidy. You would have never known that I skipped it unless you're reading the papers of Gibson from 1650, which I doubt most of you are. You would have never known, and we could have just moved on. I don't want to do that because the reality is that things are not as neat and tidy as people want to think they are. And I think the true story is much more interesting anyway than the folk tales that people tell about this stuff. Okay? Any questions?
Were all those fixed that we know of or not?
Well, you still have bishopric in Acts 1, don't you? The question is, what do you mean by fixed? So, would bishopric still be an appropriate translation? Could it still work as a translation in Acts 1? I would say yes. Okay? But if what Hill is saying is right, the intent there is to strengthen the connection. Okay? I don't think bishopric is technically wrong or an incorrect translation. The funny business with 1 Corinthians 12:28 is wrong. It is not helps in governments. It is helps, comma, what? Governments. So,
all the ones that are wrong, have those been put back to where?
So the only one, let me be very clear, the only one that I have encountered, because we can only look at 6,
Okay.
we only know for sure of the 6 that are mentioned by Hill, that I would say was wrong and needed to be fixed, was the one in 1 Corinthians 12:28 that was fixed. Helps, comma, governments is the correct reading. Helps in governments is an Anglican reading. That Hill and others are saying was put there by bishops of the Anglican Church to strengthen their high church view of church government. It was fixed. So we've got to be really careful and precise in what we're saying. Yes, there are these places where the text was altered. Altered does not automatically mean error. The one in 1 Corinthians 12:28, I think, is a clear alteration that resulted in a private reading. You follow what I'm saying? Okay?
Meaning private interpretation?
I mean a private reading, a private interpretation that is specific to Anglican view of church government. Yes. But well, obviously are people crying foul? And as they cry foul, eventually is it fixed? Okay, but we can see very clearly in the 1611 that it says helps in governments. Okay? Is that all right? Thor, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's at least try to get this next point. The question of authorization. I'm going to have to move some of the second point. We're going to have to move to the next study. The question of authorization. Okay. In addition to not knowing when it was first published, so remember we talked about that in lesson 185. We don't know for sure when it first was printed. In addition to not knowing when it was first published, the King James appears to have never been officially, quote, authorized, despite being commonly known, or known commonly as the authorized version. Dr. Norton states the following regarding this question, quote, though commonly known as the authorized version, it appears not to have been officially authorized. A royal proclamation from 1541 had ordered a Bible of the largest and greatest volume to be had in every church. First, the Great Bible, then the bishops had supplied this need. The first edition of the King James Bible was also a Bible of the largest and greatest volume, and so replenished the supply of church Bibles. The finely engraved title page by Cornelius Bull reads, the Holy Bible containing the Old Testament and New Testament translated out of the original tongues with the former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special commandment appointed to be read in the churches, imprinted at London by Robert Barker. Printed to the King's most excellent Majesty, Anno Domini 1611. The use of appointed and the absence of authorized are striking. The more striking is that the Bishop's Bible after 1585 had been authorized and appointed to be read in the churches. However, moreover, there is no official record of authorization. For these reasons, I prefer to call this Bible the King James Bible. So that is Norton's opinion, okay? When after 1611, church officials, in keeping with the 1541 injunctions, needed a new church Bible, they generally specified either a Bible of the latest edition or of the last translation, or they used the injunctions phrase, a Bible of the largest volume. This description, or perhaps nickname, authorized, crept in. In 1619, Archbishop Abbott, who had been one of the translators, describes the King James Bible as, quote, the Bible of the new translation, lately set forth by His Majesty's authority. And in 1620, Ambrose Usher describes it as the authorized Bible. And then on the next page, you can see the title page. So this is an imprint of the title page from a 1611. And again, you will notice it does not say on it anywhere authorized. All right? Go to page 6. Dr. Fincham offers an interesting counter-argument for maintaining that the translation was authorized by King James. Please note that I have Americanized some of Fincham's British spellings. He says, quote, contrary, there is plenty of evidence that some contemporaries did see the new translation as authorized, given King James I's widely reported sponsoring of it at Hampton Court, and his public undertaking there, once the text was finalized, that it would be ratified by royal authority. Certainly the King's commissioning of the project and its publication with the title page stating that it was, quote, newly translated by, quote, His Majesty's special commandment was evidently regarded as sufficient authorization by bishops, divines, and parish officials. A number of ecclesiastical ordinaries, right? That's right, ordinaries, like Bishop Smith of Gloucester, referred to their visitation articles to the, quote, new translation lately set forth by His Majesty's authority. And Smith's voice carries weight as a translator and author of the preface to the Bible. Smith's phrase was also used by John White in an anti-Catholic tract of 1614, while in the same year, a diocesan mandate, Archbishop Matthew of York simply called it, quote, the King's Bible. Church wardens' presentments in several dioceses sometimes refer to the New Bible as, quote, the King's Translation, or, quote, lately set forth by His Majesty's authority, or else, quote, allowed and commanded by His Majesty. This took visual form at St. Mary's, Lancaster, which erected in 1619, 2 years after James I's visit on his return from Scotland. The tester, or sounding board of the pulpit, recently reconstructed along the original lines, carries an engraved copy of a Bible surmounted by the crown, a tribute to James I as Supreme Governor, and surely a monument to the new translation as authorized by the King. This widespread belief that the new translation was authorized matters to us, since it provided the legality for bishops to require its purchase and replace a serviceable older translation, and it explains why no church warden challenged their right to do so. It is true that the authorized version as a phrase only dates from the 1820s. I need to check that date. I think that should say 1620s. I think I typed that wrong. But its meaning was familiar to many Jacobins, so I need to check that spot. So Fincham is offering the argument that, okay, yeah, the specific language authorized version wasn't used, but are there plenty of actions and activities of people within the Anglican Church that would suggest that they viewed it as having been authorized by the King? Okay? So regarding the authorization question, Dr. Norton agrees with the following statement made by Alfred W. Pollard in his famous work from 1911, Records of the English Bible. Quote, the word appointed is considerably weaker than the word authorized, it's considerably weaker than authorized and appointed, which it replaced. But itself, appointed, means little more than assigned or provided, and the words appointed to be read in the churches literally expressed the facts that the Bible was printed by the king's printer with approval of the king and bishops for use in the churches, and that no competing edition of the largest volume was to be published. So there's question and debate whether or not it was ever officially authorized. There's no record of it being officially entered in. We don't even know for sure when it first appeared from the press, much less there being an entry in the records of the stationer's company that this thing was officially authorized. Okay, so it becomes known popularly as the authorized version. Fincham is pointing out that there are many different things and actions that Anglican bishops and authorities took that would suggest they viewed it as having been authorized, but that specific language is not attached to it by the printer. So it's sort of, was it authorized or wasn't it? I would say the answer is yes and no. Yeah, it's authorized. I think it probably was, but it's never clearly stated or entered using that exact word. But if you were a steward of an Anglican church, and let's say you had a bishop's pulpit Bible, which was a bishop's Bible, and it had worn out, the expectation would have been that you would have replaced it with what? A King James. You following that? Now, the next point is simply too long to cover in 10 minutes. And it deals with the question of, was the King James Bible ever copyrighted? And I think the thing that would be prudent to do at this point would be to slide that to the beginning of next week's lesson, which probably means I'm going to have to slide stuff out of next week's lesson into the next week's lesson, which is a good problem for me to have because it means I'm ahead of the game. Okay? Now, But we do have time. Does anybody have any questions or comments about any of this?
I got one, I guess. In Revelations 22, how does that fall under all this? 19.
About adding and subtracting?
Yep.
It's a great question. Again, I use the phrase inconvenient truth. Many King James advocates and defenders of the traditional text, will use this verse as a way to sort of disparage modern versions and the whole-scale changes that they're making. But yet, when we look at a 1611, did the bishops of the Anglican Church clearly mess with the reading? They did. They did. The evidence suggests that this is not a printer error. And remember what we said when we looked at the notes of Boyce. Boyce has a comment in his notes on verse 29. And in his comment on the notes on verse 29, he mentions the previous verse and the Greek word that's translated helps. So what does that tell you? That tells me, did that verse come up in discussion at the general meeting late in the game, and did they specifically talk about this verse in that spot? Appears that they did. Someone, somewhere, inserted that reading. Whether it was Bancroft or Bilson or another Anglican official.
Because they knew that was in there, right?
I will have to say yes. But you need to understand, though, whoever did this, were they acting out of concert or out of harmony with the will of the translators as a whole? We have no evidence to suggest that the translators themselves rendered it that way. This would have been something that somebody tampered with after they were done, before it was printed. So you cannot say that the translators wanted it to read that way. What you can say is that somebody tampered with the verse. So the issue of the tampering of the verse would be at the fault of the person or persons who decided to do that. And then later, 1620, now you guys will see like what a real dork I am, because I have a 1628. See if I can find it in a relatively quick amount of time. It's 1629. So here's my PDF of a 1629 AV. So here's the title page. This was printed at Cambridge. Is this specifically dated? I'm not sure. But if we go, let me see if I can find it relatively quickly. That's, what is this, Judith? No, we don't want Judith. Amy, were you going to ask or state something while I wait for this to generate?
Yes.
Looked like you were. What's up?
Helps in government. Could these Anglican bishops be thinking, it sounds like they had church authority, like over their congregations or whatever. They had a role of leadership or whatever. Could this helps in government be, say, people that help those who are leading?
It's more intentional than that. It is a specific statement to undermine the division between elders and deacons.
Okay.
That they viewed those as subservient to the other.
Okay.
The Puritans viewed those as unique and distinct giftings that were of equal standing. You see what I'm saying? The Anglicans thought that the bishops, the elders, were superior to, and the the deacons were subservient to them. What the Puritans believed is no, they are distinct, yes, but equal giftings. So to say it helps in governments is to imply that the one is subservient to the other, which is exactly the way the Anglicans thought of it. Okay? So here's 1629. Here's 1 Corinthians 12:28. Notice, thirdly, teachers, after that miracles, and then gifts of healing, helps, comma, what? So by 1629 had this been fixed. So in Hill's sermon from 1648, when he's talking about 1 Corinthians 12:28, and he talks about how it's been changed, this is exactly what he's talking about, because in 1629 was the reading fixed.
Yep.
There it is right there. And is that the same as you have it in your Bible in front of you?
Yep.
Okay? So, any other questions or comments? Yeah.
So, I was looking up some verses, and I wondered, did these Anglican bishops, were they familiar with Jesus' words in Matthew 20:25 to 28?
Well, I'm assuming they're familiar with it, but where are we at?
Matthew 20:25 to 28.
But Jesus called them unto him. Right? Matthew 20:25.
Yeah.
But Jesus called them unto him and said, Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them. Is that what you're talking about?
Yep.
Dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be among you, but whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. So what are you thinking with that question?
Well, Jesus is telling the disciples there that you're not going to be like exercising some kind of authority over people. That's not the way I want you to operate. And it sounds like these bishops want to like take their position and use it to tell the people how they gotta operate.
See, the Anglican, I think they're set up the same way the Catholics are.
So this is why we got to keep in mind the politics. Okay, the Anglicans were marginally improved over the Catholics. But instead of having the Pope be the head of the church, who's head of the Church of England? The king, the queen, right? Do they still believe in the Catholic doctrine of apostolic succession? So do these bishops believe that they are having their authority allocated to them via the same process of apostolic succession that a Roman Catholic bishop would view their authority as being allocated to them? But the Puritans look at the Anglican Church and they say, you guys haven't reformed enough. That's what a Puritan was. Somebody who looked at the Anglican Church and said, yeah, great, you guys, you don't do this, you don't do that, but you haven't gone far enough. And so here we see, in this example, where the politics comes in to the whole equation. But again, everything I'm saying, I have showed you from the documents. Okay? People are going to hear this and they're going to lose their ever-loving mind. Because what I'm saying does not go with the folklore that has developed within the King James only movement about some of this stuff. And what I'm saying is, I want the truth, and I can deal with the truth if I have the truth over the folklore. Okay? Is there a reading that appears to have been highly intentional that was later what?
Changed.
Fixed. Fixed. This is what it should say. This is what Tyndale had. This is what Matthews had. This is what the Great Bible had. It's what the Geneva Bible had. It's what the Bishop's Bible had. It always said helps common governments until here. And of course I clicked on the wrong thing until right here, where all of a sudden it's helps and governance. And now do we have sermons contemporaneous, preached by people who knew the people involved, who said Bancroft and Bilson and possibly other bishops altered some of the readings? Okay? All right, well, now we're past time. Somehow we always have 10 minutes to spare and end up 12 minutes over.